All right, secular Buddhists, man. Let's get it started. We mentioned Buddhist modernism not too long ago. And I was careful to explain how, although Buddhist modernism is a response to a modernity that was imposed by Western imperialism, it's still Buddhism. It's a form of Buddhism that was created by sincere Buddhists engaging with their own tradition, of which they were fully a part and understood well, with full agency. Secular Buddhism is closer to a form of Buddhism. I don't know if you can hear the air quotes I'm doing when I say that, which emerged from the imagination of Orientalist scholars in the imperial core, or at least in the employ of the governments of the imperial core. Now, the story of secular Buddhism, a lot like the story of real Buddhism, starts in India. But unlike the story of Buddhism, our founding cast of characters are not from the subcontinent themselves. They're British scholars that are working for the government that at this time is extracting India's labor and resources. Now, these scholars, historians, archaeologists, philologists, philosophers, they were curious about Indian religion, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. If you or I found ourselves in India and we wanted to learn something about Indian religion, what would we do first to satisfy our curiosity? I'll let you think for a second. Hopefully, your answer sounds something like, well, I'd find a place of worship or the time and location of some religious activity, and I'd ask around. But that's not the approach that British scholars took. The reason for this is no doubt related to the perception that no one outside Europe likely had anything to say that was worth listening to. Instead, the study of Indian religion would have to take place in a manner more resembling the way one would study the ancient past. That's through archaeology. This avoided the risk of non-Europeans corrupting the study of their own cultures with their surely, backwards and superstitious epistemologies and narratives, right? I say that with sarcasm. As the British dug, they found texts in Brahmi, Sanskrit, and Pali, among other languages, and they started translating them. Now, the ideology of these scholars, of course, varied, but we'd do well to keep in mind the phenomenon of modernism, right? Protestant scientism that I discussed in the video about Vipassana. Now, I won't spend the same amount of time talking about it here, but basically imagine what a typical Redditor believes, right? He hecking loves science, he hecking loves logic, and he knows that his mind, man, is an unchanging and unbiased medium that can be trusted completely to just convey truth, just directly from the principles of logic and rationality, all right? Now, although the framework that guides him is absolutely derivative of Protestantism, he's beginning to get uncomfortable with the aspects of Christianity that require him to, humble himself and his glorious mind to a higher power, and to accept that there are things he can't, or at least doesn't yet understand. Although he's sure that the, air quotes, primitive peoples of Asia and Africa can't possibly themselves have anything to offer him, he might wonder whether it's possible that way back in the day, their ancestors may have been a little more sophisticated, and they, back then, might have written something down that could solve his dilemma, give him something that suits his rationalistic ego a little better, probably before some sort of collapse that led to the current sorry state of these, lesser cultures. his rational and scientific mind should be more than able, looking at the materials he finds in the non-Western world, to separate the ancient and enlightened wheat from the inferior, superstitious chaff, mixed in, certainly, by a later and less intelligent people. Now imagine that guy, that Redditor, arrives in 19th century India with a shovel and finds Buddhist scriptures and starts to translate them into English or German or French. He writes his own secondary literature about them, telling you what Buddhism is all about. It turns out that this guy in India, a little over 2,000 years ago, agreed with him on everything. So long, that is, you leave out the backwards nonsense that surely is mere cultural baggage. I'm sure you see the issue here. He picks which texts are real Buddhism, right? Original Buddhism, early Buddhism, right? And he leaves out the other ones that don't fit his narrative. Then he writes extensive commentary on the already cherry-picked text he's decided to translate. Now, the books he and his colleagues write on Buddhism... Excuse my girlfriend's cat. The books that he and his colleagues write on Buddhism become the only source on what Buddhists believe that is accessible to readers back in Europe and North America. Many of them explain a theory of decline. The historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, much like the authors of these texts, it turns out, hecking loved science and rationality and loathed superstition and ritual. He laid out a philosophical and psychological framework, apparently, that asks human beings to use the power of reason and observation. Now, this is contradicted in the scriptures that were found by frequent references to the supernatural, to things like past and future lives, nature spirits, heavens and hells, gods and demons, Buddhas and bodhisattvas that are abiding in the cosmos to dispense ritual instructions. Now, the primitive locals, oddly, didn't seem to see any contradiction here. Likely because they weren't capable of understanding these teachings that they had preserved and passed down, and therefore couldn't differentiate the Buddha's true teachings from the mere cultural baggage. Therefore, it must be the case that if in the distant past there was a golden age of Buddhism that gradually declined until reaching the present day, where Buddhists in Asia are doing it all wrong. Maybe the Buddha was even white, and racial degeneration led to the current situation. This was a real hypothesis. Regardless, luckily, the white man is here now to reform the Dharma. The form of Buddhism that these scholars developed is, more or less, what we call secular Buddhism today, in terms of the content. Now, at the time they were writing, there was no other narrative to compete with in Western languages, so they could just call it Buddhism. Today, globalization makes it so that anyone can see the discrepancy between Buddhism in Asia and among the Asian diaspora and the homunculus birthed by Victorian scholarship. So now it has become necessary to label the former as religious Buddhism and the latter as secular Buddhism. Most, although not all, times you hear people talk about how Buddhism is not a religion, but a philosophy or a science, or about how Buddhism doesn't ask you to take things on faith, but instead depends on reason, or about how Shakyamuni Buddha didn't want people to worship him. They're secular Buddhists. And almost every time you hear somebody outright reject the phenomena in Buddhism that get categorized as supernatural by some, or use the term cultural baggage, those are secular Buddhists. Now, in all fairness, a lot, I'm sure most, secular Buddhists today don't know that their Buddhology is that of the British Empire, and most are not bad people. However, there is a decisive moment when these people encounter, I'll say, normative Buddhism, as it is practiced in Asia by the diaspora, and yes, by plenty of black, white, Hispanic, whoever people that are practicing with them. There are 4 general responses. One of them is to say, these people aren't doing it right. Now, this is obviously chauvinistic. There's really no difference between this line of thinking and that of British Orientalists. You simply need to think that Asian people completely misunderstood Buddhism for 2,000 years until white people corrected them. The second is, well, to each their own. I won't denigrate the way that these people practice religious Buddhism, but that doesn't mean that my secular Buddhism is any less Buddhist. Now, this is obviously not as bad as the first, and I'd, break bread with anybody who was saying this. Sure, a lot of people probably won't even see why this is objectionable, but I still find this position a little frustrating. For Buddhists, supernatural, I'm doing air quotes again, cosmology, isn't some subplot, side quest happening in tandem but unrelated to the Buddha's core teachings on meditations or ethics or ontology. It's central to what our mission is. Theravada Buddhists want to become arhats. That means escaping a cycle of samsara that is explicitly and repeatedly understood to involve past and future rebirths. From a Theravada perspective, if samsara was, so to speak, for one lifetime only, arhatship would be, and I don't want to be morbid here, as simple as just killing yourself. Then you're out, you're nirvana, blowing out. You don't experience the cycle of rebirth anymore. The meditative and philosophical aspects of Theravada exist as a path toward an explicitly supernatural goal of arhatship, which for them transcends samsara into a place beyond life or death. Please understand, I'm not saying that for Theravadins, arhatship is the same as a permanent death. I'm saying that from a secular interpretation, that's all that arhatship could be. For Mahayanists, it's even less possible to sideline the quote-unquote supernatural. The centerpiece of all Mahayana Buddhism is the Bodhisattva path, the resolve to reject transcendence of samsara in favor of becoming a permanently abiding Buddha capable of saving infinite suffering beings right here, becoming an eminentalist Buddha, okay? Now, if there's only one lifetime, and sentient beings only suffer for one lifetime, and nirvana isn't even a real state of being, it's just being happy, okay? Then the Bodhisattva path is just nonsensical. It is without a doubt true that there are elements of Buddhism that can be useful for people who do not accept Buddhist cosmology or soteriology. Meditation does seem to help with mental health, and Buddhist philosophical insights regarding ontology and ethics do often stand completely on their own in the realm of secular philosophy. The problem with accepting only these elements of Buddhism isn't accepting them while rejecting their soteriological purpose. It's accepting them, rejecting their soteriological purpose, and still claiming that that's Buddhism. If a person says, I don't believe in God or the resurrection of Christ, but I find 5 out of the 10 commandments morally useful, and maybe around 70% of the Sermon on the Mount, so I'm basically a Christian. Surely no one would bat an eye when Nicene Creed-believing Christians say that that person isn't a Christian. If a person says, I don't believe in God, or that the angel Gabriel transmitted the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad, but I think that zakat is a good social practice, and I appreciate the role Islam has played in some anti-colonial movements, so I'm basically a Muslim, aren't I? Very few would begrudge Shahada-taking Muslims for saying that, not really. And yet, when someone says, I don't believe in karma, rebirth, nirvana, monasticism, or most of the sutras, but I like to do breath meditation and I think non-self is philosophically compelling, so I'm a Buddhist, there tends to be a judgmental reaction when Buddhists even gently explain what the Buddhist tradition actually teaches. The problem with insisting on a Buddhism without such principles is that it arrogantly assumes that it is up to white hippies to decide what the minimum essentials to Buddhist identity are, and not the Buddhist tradition which has settled these questions hundreds, if not thousands of years ago. There are two other reactions that can be constructive, though. The first is to say, oh, I guess I was mistaken about what Buddhists believe. It seems that I'm not, in fact, a Buddhist, but the elements of Buddhism I find interesting, in philosophy, meditation, or whatever else, will still be a part of my life and help me be happy and fulfilled. It's a great thing when aspects of the Buddha Dharma can help anyone, even if the person they help isn't a Buddhist. The final, and I would say optimal response is to say, I didn't realize Buddhists believed in all this stuff that's unfamiliar to me. Because these people who believe this crazy stuff have preserved and passed down the philosophical and meditative teachings that ring so true to me, they probably aren't just credulous rubes who believe anything. Maybe there's something to this stuff. I think I'll look into it. And if I still feel convinced, maybe I'll take refuge and become a Buddhist in a real tradition myself. I hope you understand, then, that my issue with secular Buddhism isn't a matter of not wanting white people to engage with the Dharma. I myself am white. I just think that the existence of secular Buddhism is inseparable from the arrogance of assuming that one knows better than every single sect and the tradition they want to claim. That's why this Wojak looks like a smug Redditor. Behind him, he has a "Let that shit go" poster, implying he thinks apathy is the heart of the Buddha's teaching. On the poster, the Buddha has blue skin, a feature associated with the iconography of the Hindu god Krishna, and as far as I know, has never been a part of how Shakyamuni has been depicted, indicating ignorance of, Buddhist iconography. He also has a large collection of Funko Pops, because secular Buddhism is the Funko Pop of Buddhism. It's mass-produced, and it's stripped of the features that make it great. Join me next time to talk about quite a different and more legitimate form of Buddhism, the Japanese Pure Land Jishu sect.